Sarah, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. It is great to be here today to speak with you all about our newest ingredient called ButyraGen, a next generation prebiotic. So first, I want to talk about butyrate. We're going to be talking a lot about butyrate today, so I wanted to introduce it and make sure everyone understands. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid. It's a metabolite of bacterial fermentation, and it is a metabolite of the fermentation of our gut bacteria, so it does exist in our guts. It can come from the diet, although the primary source of it really is from metabolite, is as a metabolite of fermentation. It is a signaling molecule, and it plays a role in the brain and the nervous system in that gut-brain axis, which we will also be discussing more of later today. And nearly all cells in the body have butyrate receptors, demonstrating that butyrate has widespread effects and can have effects all over the body, as well as many benefits. Why is butyrate important? So one reason is that butyrate is the major energy source for colonocytes, or the cells that make up the lining of the gut. The rest of our body uses many types of energy sources. You may have heard it uses sugar, it uses fats, but our gut lining really does primarily use butyrate for its normal cell functioning. So it is important to have enough butyrate to keep those cells active and healthy and keep the integrity of our gut barrier intact. There are also many other effects that butyrate can have. One is through its action as a signaling molecule. Many cells in our body and many types of cells have butyrate receptors on them. And so through this activity as a signaling molecule, butyrate can have an effect on gut barrier integrity. It helps encourage increased production of mucus and tight junction proteins to keep that barrier strong. It plays a signaling role in the gut-brain axis, as I mentioned, and in addition, many other gut organ axes. And it can help activate and regulate the immune system and inflammatory responses in the body. In addition, it can help support our gut microbiome via a totally different way. Butyrate is slightly acidic, and so it lowers the pH of the environment in the gut. And the beneficial bacteria that we get a lot of our health benefits from tend to like that more acidic environment. And a lot of the not so good bacteria don't really like that acidic environment. So this helps support a balance in the gut microbiome with more healthy bacteria and not so many of the not so good bacteria. So how is butyrate generated in the body? As I mentioned, it is a product of fermentation. So when we consume things that are considered fibers, prebiotics, the bacteria in our gut ferment those prebiotics and fibers. And as Len so beautifully mentioned, sometimes other types of things too can be fermented and have those prebiotic effects. Butyrate is produced from that fermentation in our gut. The concentration of butyrate is the highest in the proximal colon, which is the beginning of the colon, the part that connects to the small intestine, where there is the most of the substrates available for fermentation. Then as the digestive moves through the colon, there is a lower concentration of the substrates, so naturally a lower concentration of the fermentation products. There are many bacteria types in particular that are of interest that produce butyrate, although the ability to produce butyrate is actually widely distributed among many types of bacteria. So we do have information on specific types of bacteria, although there are more than just those few specific types that can produce butyrate in the gut. So how does butyrate do all of this? There are two primary mechanisms of action. The first one is histone deacetylase inhibition. So histone deacetylases are enzymes that play a role in gene expression in our bodies. And by gene expression, I mean the action of actually turning our DNA into metabolites or initiating processes that are coded in our DNA. And histone deacetylases actually tend to downregulate gene expression. So when butyrate acts as a histone deacetylase inhibitor, it encourages upregulation of gene expression. And this is typically how when butyrate signals for increased production of this thing or the other, it's usually through this mechanism. And histone deacetylases are found all throughout the body. because DNA is found all throughout the body. So this really is a full body effect that butyrate can have. The other main mechanism of action that butyrate uses is through free fatty acid receptors. As it says in the name, these receptors are specific for free fatty acids, but they are particularly attuned to short chain fatty acids. So there are two types. They are a type of G protein coupled receptor that exists on many types of cells in our bodies. So what happens when butyrate binds to these receptors, the receptor receives that signal and often signals for a cascade of other actions to happen. So we've talked about butyrate now and why it's important. Let's move on to talking about our Butyrate Generator. ButyraGen is our newest product. It's a next generation prebiotic. It's a direct butyrate generator and is different from a lot of traditional prebiotics. And I'll go into why that is in a few minutes. The main active in ButyraGen is tributyrin. It is a glycerol with 3 butyrate molecules bonded to it, and ButyraGen is made up of 50% tributyrin. The other ingredients in ButyraGen are sun fiber, partially hydrolyzed guar fiber, acacia fiber, rosemary extract, and microcrystalline cellulose to help with the flow of the powder. This ingredient is a self-affirmed GRAS ingredient. It's safe for infants and it's safe for pets, and it is low FODMAP. So I mentioned sun fiber. I am only going to touch on this briefly because our next presenter is an expert in sun fiber and we'll be talking about it extensively. But sun fiber is an ingredient in ButyraGen, and adding that to the ingredient adds an additional prebiotic to the mixture. So we have another source of that prebiotic activity within ButyraGen. Sun fiber also has a pretty low water activity, and adding that to ButyraGen helps lower the water activity of the mixture. It's odorless and tasteless and adds no major effects or differences to ButyraGen as a whole. So let's talk about what happens in the gut when you take ButyraGen. So this box on the left represents ButyraGen as a whole. Tributyrin is a part of that. Let's zoom in on tributyrin specifically. Like I mentioned, it is a glycerol backbone and it has 3 butyrates attached. So what you can see here represented by these scissors is an enzyme coming in to cleave off these butyrate molecules. There are enzymes in the gut that everybody has. They're ubiquitous and they're common, that are attuned specifically to hydrolyzing fatty acids from glycerol backbones. So when you consume ButyraGen, the tributyrin in there is cleaved by these enzymes, which directly produces these 3 butyrate molecules. That's why we say that this is a direct butyrate generator, because the butyrates are not generated through an indirect mechanism like fermentation that requires a lot of steps, but it comes directly from this tributyrin molecule. These butyrates then move into the large intestine and have a lot of the effects that we've discussed already. So if we go back then and we look at the sun fiber, the other portion of ButyraGen, and actually the glycerol backbone as well, these will move to the large intestine, and these are fermented in the traditional way that prebiotics act. So from that, we get some additional short-chain fatty acids. So we have started investigating what happens realistically in the gut when someone consumes ButyraGen. And to do this, the first thing we've done is some in vitro studies that have used samples of human stool as sort of a microbiome starter culture. And they actually have used samples from 6 different people. So we have a variety of microbiomes that we can look at the effects of. So these samples have prebiotics added to them. They're left to ferment in an anaerobic environment for 48 hours. And then after those 48 hours, we measure the output. So in this case, we're looking at the butyrate generation in this system when ButyraGen is added and how that compares to a couple of other prebiotics. So here on the left, we compared to XOS, and on the right, 2 doses compared to inulin. So we'll start with XOS. You can see here the 200 milligram dose of ButyraGen, which is our current recommended dose. It produces the same amount of butyrate as a typical dose of XOS. So this was 1 gram of XOS added to this system. I think, as far as I'm aware, it is the current lowest dose prebiotic on the market, but ButyraGen with just a fraction of that mass produced the same amount of butyrate in the system as XOS. And then, of course, going much higher with the dose of ButyraGen, you see a much higher production of butyrate in the system. Moving over to the inulin graph, we did see the same effect here. 200 milligrams of ButyraGen performed the same as inulin, which was a 4-gram dose. And of course, again, a higher dose, this one is 1,000 as opposed to 2,000, but still produced much more butyrate than the lower dose. Some sort of interesting side observations we saw in these graphs was this box for inulin being so long, indicating that the response in butyrate generation as an output was pretty varied when inulin was fermented. And this is something that is kind of commonly known about inulin. A lot of different people have a lot of different responses to taking inulin. So when we compare that with the ButyraGen data, we don't see it stretch quite as far, meaning that people had a more uniform response in terms of butyrate generation. And because this is a direct butyrate generator and it doesn't rely on fermentation, so the variability in the gut microbiome doesn't play as much of a role, that makes sense that we wouldn't see so much of a variation in the response. We also looked at gas production in these fermentation systems. Again, on the left, we compared to XOS. XOS produced a little bit of gas, but then if we look at ButyraGen, significantly less gas production from the fermentation of both of those doses than from XOS. Then we move to the inulin graph. Don't be fooled by these graphs. They're the same size, but the y-axis is different. Inulin produced a lot more gas, and that is also something that's commonly known about inulin. It tends to cause gas troubles for a lot of people. And then if we look at the ButyraGen doses, they are way down here, closer to control. So there's not really a lot of gas that's produced. Something interesting to point out is in these graphs, even when we increase the dose very much, there isn't much of a difference in the gas production response. So we don't see an incremental increase in gas production with increased dose. And that's because ButyraGen doesn't produce much gas in the first place. So when the dose of it is increased, I apologize about that siren, I'm in Chicago. So when the dose of ButyraGen does increase, the gas production doesn't really increase with it. So finally, we looked at synergy with probiotics, and we looked specifically at LGG. I don't remember the full name of it off the top of my head, but it's a common lactobacillus probiotic. We looked at it in combination with 2 different doses of ButyraGen. Then we also looked at butyrate generation from the probiotic alone, and each of those doses of ButyraGen alone. So you can see at this high dose of ButyraGen with the probiotic combined, a much, much higher amount of butyrate was generated. And actually, if you compare the ButyraGen dose alone, and if you were to add this LGG box on top of it, you can see that ButyraGen and LGG combined actually produced a little bit more butyrate. So that did give us a true 1 + 1 = 3 synergistic effect. That was a really exciting thing for us to see. And going back to our mechanism of action, this is why we saw that. It's because of this extra fermentation that happens in addition to the direct butyrate generation. The glycerol from the tributyrin and the sun fiber get to the large intestine and are fermented by the microbiome. So from that, we get more butyrate in addition to some other short-chain fatty acids. And we actually looked at the butyrate generation efficiency from these samples and saw that they were over 100% with that synergistic combination of the LGG and the ButyraGen, meaning that we got more butyrate from that fermentation than we would have expected had we only accounted for the butyrate that comes directly from tributyrin. So I've talked a lot about butyrate, a lot of the things that it does in the body, and I've shown you that ButyraGen is a great butyrate generator. So now we can connect the dots and show you that ButyraGen can support many, many health benefits in bodily functions. I won't read through all of these because there's quite a few, But we do have information if you would like to read more about these. We have some wonderful tech sheets, and you can reach out to somebody at NutriScience. We'll be happy to share. These are all things that we have seen in the literature have a connection between this outcome and butyrate concentration in the gut. So now to talk about some of our human data that we have, we did a small pilot study with ButyraGen where participants took it for 3 weeks every day. And we looked at their gastrointestinal symptoms as well as their gut microbiome before and after. So the gastrointestinal symptoms that were self-reported by these participants dramatically improved. That it's a pilot study, but was still very exciting for us to see. Some participants, their bloating and their gas even went down to almost 0. There was an increase in relative abundance of Akkermansia, which is a bacteria that is of interest right now to a lot of people. There's a lot of research happening on how it can be beneficial for health. And then finally, we saw a decrease in relative abundance of bacteria that tend to be associated with negative symptoms. And that is really interesting considering we saw such improvements in the self-reported gastrointestinal symptoms.